The Pest and Predator Podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. Welcome to the Pest and Predator Podcast, brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. I'm your host, Sean Haney, founder of RealAgriculture.com. Today's guest in the Pest and Predator Podcast is Nevin Rosaasen. He's the Sustainability and Government Relations Lead with Alberta Pulse Growers. Nevin, great to chat with you again.
Great to be on your podcast, Sean.
Yeah, this is such an important podcast. I know the audience is learning. I know I'm learning. Every time we talk about some of these topics, there's always something that comes out of it that it really, really does benefit the agronomic side of the farm. So let's get into it. Today we're going to talk about biodiversity. Now, I know this is something you're very, very passionate about. Why is it important? Why is biodiversity important, and how do farmers contribute to it?
Great question, Sean. So biodiversity refers to everything living within an area, and that includes not only animals, but plants, fungi, and bacteria. And just as biodiversity is really important in our soils, biodiversity is really important in our forests, insect biodiversity is also very important when it comes to broadacre agriculture, and specifically Western Canada. Biodiversity is so important that Canada has also made commitments to biodiversity, just as we've made commitments to reduce our greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas emissions. We are also signatories to COP15, the Convention of the Parties for Biodiversity. So this is important in setting targets. Where biodiversity on farms varies, if you look at different regions, for instance, southern Saskatchewan and Alberta, field size is very large. There's minimal land or undisturbed areas of vegetation, so to speak. But when you move further north, farms in the parkland region, Prairie pothole region, they have a lot more woodlots and wetlands and even stone piles that serve as habitat. So this biodiversity is important. Farmers contribute to it by keeping undisturbed vegetation. Even old shelter belts also contribute to biodiversity.
So, Nevin, I just want to back up. You said insect biodiversity. Now, I think where you're going with that is where we get into the conversation of beneficials. Is that's correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. Because that makes sense. Because when I think of when at first glance you're like, oh, insect biodiversity. Why would I want more insects in my field? But yeah, it's about these beneficials, right?
That's correct. And I mean, often Western Canadian agriculture, if you're an urbanite and you've driven Highway 1, all you see is these wide open fields, right? And certainly that is a region where we're struggling to have biodiversity to provide habitat for these beneficial insects. But as you travel further north, I mean, if you've ever driven from Edmonton to Saskatoon and you've crisscrossed some of that region, you recognize how much there is in diversity, and not even just willows and poplars, but other evergreen trees, etc. And to give you an example, on my family farm, of the acres we own, 24% of those acres are either wetland, woodlot, fence line, or stone pile. So that's almost a quarter of our acres that are acting as habitat for a whole range of different species. So it's really important. And I mean, within these undisturbed areas, we find also overwintering sites, and you nailed it. Those predators, those parasitoid insects, those are the ones that keep our insect pest populations in check, but also that those sites provide overwintering sites for not only those beneficials, but also for crop pests, which can be a concern to some producers. And many farmers that I've talked with on the topic of biodiversity say, well, yeah, that's an undisturbed site, and there might be a predator or a parasitoid species, but there's also crop pests that overwinter there. And this is an area where, we don't quite know how good the benefit is to how much of a problem it can be in the next year's crop. So certainly an area of research. We know open pollinated crops such as canola will have higher yields if there's undisturbed vegetation that's near, right? They're open pollinated. They need those pollinators, those native bees, flies, butterflies, etc. So we know that those habitats contribute to higher yields in those open pollinated crops.
So you mentioned research. Are there areas where we could be doing more research on this topic?
Absolutely. And I mean, we don't currently have surveys of beneficials on farms. We do, however, have crop pest surveys that feed into our prairie pest monitoring network, right? So we have maps from the previous year of where we've seen these crop pests. They can help inform us and be an early prediction tool for what we might see the coming year for crop pests. But we still have very little understanding of, invertebrate biodiversity within wetlands, even amphibians, other creatures that play an important role in functioning ecosystems. We have new technologies such as eDNA or environmental DNA, where you can basically blend everything up, including all the invertebrates that you would find in a sweep net in a wetland, and then, using DNA, sort out what species are actually present. So here in Alberta, for instance, we have the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, or ABMI. They're investing in trying to find out, more about biodiversity on the prairies. We also have Innotech, or Alberta Innovates, Ducks Unlimited, the University of Alberta, University of Calgary, that are all doing research on biodiversity. But there's certainly much more work to do.
Now, how should farmers, because my assumption here again is that depending on your geography, and you've kind of given some of the geographical differences and the realities, how should farmers be thinking about biodiversity on their farms?
Well, first off, farmers should be aware that healthy ecosystems mean healthy crops, right? And they also it means that you will not be limited by yield if you do not have those pollinators on your crops like canola or other open pollinated crops. But when, farmers should be aware that when they're making a decision whether to drain a slough, which in Alberta, you need permits and you need to navigate the Water Act, etc. So it's illegal unless it's permitted, but draining a slough, even burying a stone pile or removing a shelter belt, an old fence line, these areas are full of life. I mean, we also hear that shelter belts in dry years will rob moisture from the headlands, and obviously wetlands represent an obstacle in the field. They definitely take away from field efficiency. Draining them allows you to farm more acres. These stone piles that are from generations past are a nuisance, but they do house beneficial insects, including those pollinators, parasitoids, and predators. They keep your insect populations in check, insect pest populations in check, and you need to have habitat for them. So farmers should recognize biodiversity is important and take more time to think about how they can maintain and enhance biodiversity on their farms. That's really what we want farmers to take away today.
How do I measure and weigh that decision on whether to try to gain some of those acres for productive crops versus the biodiversity element? Like, what goes into, like, how do I weigh those options and try to figure out what's the best decision for me?
And that's a great point. And there's no perfect answer. Every farm, every situation, every field is going to be different.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if you're trying to increase the field size from 640 acres to 900 acres, the question is, are you going to gain that much efficiency, right?
Yep.
If you take out the one fence line where, you're going from 2/4 sections into a full half section and you've got that field efficiency, and maybe you have a stone pile in the corner and another fence line along that half section, well, then the benefits would outweigh, the additional acres. So I think the best way to figure it out is to do a partial budget, see how much field efficiency you're actually going to increase, and just have biodiversity in the back of your mind. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. There's no perfect answer. There's no, economic ROI or any type of table that exists out there for biodiversity. And, we're only just scratching the surface with field harrows at this continuing education, this knowledge transfer that, we've got these bright young entomologists. What we need to start recognizing is that there's more to learn. And certainly, I mean, it's much harder to replace a wetland than to remove one, right? They don't nearly have as much benefits, right, when they're removed and then replaced. Certainly with shelter belts, they take years to get established, right? So just a second thought in your mind in how does this benefit me directly? And certainly in this day and age with the price of land, the economic rules are such that anytime you can gain a couple acres, right, it's to your benefit. We're looking at more and more programs that are coming out to pay farmers to keep, some wetlands, also to preserve some grasslands, et cetera. And we're just scratching the surface on understanding this whole biodiversity equation.
Great stuff. Hey, Nevin, this has been fantastic to talk to you. This is a really important topic of biodiversity. I think it's one where everybody defines it probably a little bit differently, or how they deal with it, and you've shed a lot of light on that discussion, that decision making. So, and once again, whatever we can do to, within reason, to protect those beneficials, those that army that is essentially working for you for free is really important. So, Nevin, thanks a lot for joining us here today.
Thanks again, Sean. Always a privilege.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Pests Predators Podcast. It's brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm.